we're here today with Beth Wilson. Beth, thank you very much for joining me on the podcast. It's so great to have you.
Oh, well, it's great to be here, Gary, and thanks for inviting me. I'm looking forward to our chat.
Well, so as am I, and the thing with the podcast is that we get to know each other in the marketplace and sort of in the Bay Street circles or in the Canadian business circles, let's call it. And often, even some of our colleagues don't really know that much about our background other than just some highlights that they know from LinkedIn or otherwise. It's a great way actually for some of our colleagues to get to know a bit more, but often aspiring leaders that think that's a very interesting career path. What could I do to do some of
Right.
that? And often, sometimes even business opportunities that arise from it. So it's been the most interesting doing about 30 of these over the last couple of years. So thank you again, Beth, for joining me.
That's great.
So I will start with a couple of questions, which is sort of our typical kickoffs. And this is a little bit about your background, Beth. So where you grew up and a bit of the early days of Beth Wilson.
So I grew up in suburban Toronto. So I've never really lived in Toronto proper. I think if you ask anyone who lived in Toronto, I grew up in Ajax, which is sort of east of Toronto. My parents were teachers, so I didn't come from a business family at all, and just had a nice sort of quiet life in terms of my upbringing.
And who would you say had the biggest impact on you, Beth, growing up?
When if you think from a business perspective and who I became as a leader, I would have to say my mom. So she was an elementary school teacher. I remember as a kid, my dad and I lived at the cottage, and mom went off to Queen's University to do her master's in education. She became a school principal. She was a leader in the Teachers Federation. So she was this woman who was really leading in her profession. So we had a little bit, I would say at that time, of a sort of a reverse role in the household, right? My dad was the one who was home when I got home from school and getting dinner ready and doing that sort of thing. So my mom was a really big influence in terms of my first really female professional role model.
And Beth, take me a little bit through the sort of early stages of your career. So you're in high school, you're trying to figure out what to study in university, etc. What
Yeah.
were some of the motivators around sort of choosing the initial path?
Yeah. So, Gary, this is kind of a funny story, and you may not be expecting this answer, but when I was in high school, up until, well, we went to grade 13 in those days. So, up until the summer of grade 12, I wanted to be a dentist. So, how does a dentist become an accountant? You may wonder. Anyway, so my mom, she was so great. She found this parent in her school who was a woman who had her own dental practice. And she arranged for me to job shadow with this terrific lady for a day. And I realized after a day with her, oh no, I don't want to be a dentist. I don't have the dexterity to be a dentist. Like, this isn't what I thought the work was going to be. But what I really found interesting in the day I spent with her was the business side of her dental practice. So, as she got talking about it, so that was sort of my first sort of inkling that, oh, I might like business. So I talked to a guidance counselor and based on, my math skills and that sort of thing, he said, well, you could either go actuarial science, become an actuary, or accountancy. But he said, based on what I know about you and sort of you're leaning towards people and leading people and that sort of thing, he said, I'd suggest you go the accountancy route. So that's how I ended up at U of T, going down the BCom route and focusing on my accounting. Yeah.
Well, and Beth, I don't find that entirely surprising. I thought I wanted to be a doctor
Okay, there
instead
you
of being a
go.
lawyer, so I have a very similar path
Both
in
of us rejected the sciences, Gary.
well, except I did a little later. I even did my undergrad in biochemistry, so
Oh,
that
okay.
I made the decision a bit later, but it was nevertheless not dissimilar. Is
Yeah.
being and sort of seeing the work firsthand, and you're like, it's very noble, great work. Perhaps not what I want to do.
Yeah. And I think it's really hard. I mean, I look at my own two sons. They're in their 20s. I think it's really hard for young people. There's this great pressure, right? To know, what do you want to do? What do you want to be? And you're supposed to start streaming in that lane very early. And sometimes they get into college or university or even start working and realize, oh, this is just not the right track for me. So, one thing I always tell young people, because you don't realize it at the time when you're in your 20s, but now when you're at the stage, you and I are at, you realize you have such a long time span in front of you, right, in terms of your career. And it's going to take a lot of twists and turns along the way. So I always tell young people, don't switch gears, go back to school if you want, try something different. Like, you just have this really long journey ahead of you.
Well, and getting some of the experiences early on, volunteering, some of that early exposure, just so meaningful, right?
Exactly.
And as you were saying, there was OAC when I did. I was like, oh yes, I had OAC as well. So the grade 13, as we now call it. So that's just it was an interesting year for preparing for university. So in
Yeah.
many ways, it had its advantages.
I agree with you, just because my own two boys didn't have the benefit of that extra year, and I think it would have helped.
And Beth, I'm going to pivot a little bit to sort of the post. So you did your BCom degree, and how did you decide I want to go work in an accounting firm? So what were sort of some of this initial
Yeah.
decision making?
I think when I entered into the BCom stream, my intention was to then go on and qualify. We were called CAs at that time, as a CA. So I was taking sort of the appropriate courses. And in those days, there weren't really there weren't co-op programs, internships. So in my third year, I guess, of university, I remember, I'm really dating myself, Gary, like going through the yellow pages and looking to see, where are all the accounting firms that are sort of in driving distance for me, and just cold mailing my CV looking for a summer job. Anyways, this firm, Thornton and Winnie, which became KPMG ultimately, hired me as a summer student. And so I started in their Scarborough office, and it was all owner managed businesses. And then when I graduated university, that just made sense to be the place to go and go through the exam process and get my CA. And I was with KPMG for 26 years.
And Beth, I'll get back to the KPMG story, but just while you were in high school and the guidance counselor even said you like leadership, etc. Were you involved in high school? Were you sort of demonstrating some leadership early on?
Yeah, I would say maybe not in the early years of high school, but in the later years of high school, I started getting more engaged. And I don't know, I think I was just always that kid, Gary, that got along with all the kids. Like, I didn't fall into any particular clique or nation. I liked everyone to sort of cooperate with each other. I was good at organizing people to do things, whether it was, I don't know, the Students Against Drunk Driving. I think that was a big deal when I was in high school. So I, got that up and running in my school. So yeah, I think early on, certainly demonstrated some of those traits.
And I asked Beth because this happens a lot where sort of early leadership sort of demonstrates later in life as well. But also, I mean, taking the initiative to just cold send your CV to some of these accounting firms and looking at things through yellow pages. And by the way, that's yellow pages are still somewhat relevant, and up until 10 years ago, I'd like to think they were still worse.
I suppose, except now we could just use Chat GPT, right, to generate the list for us. So
Give
a
me a list of all the
little
accounting firms. It
different.
takes 30 seconds
Yeah.
now. So.
I think because I came from a family of teachers, and they I mean, my mom and dad, they were great people and they were so supportive of me, but they didn't have a network, right? They didn't have. So I was sort of left to my own devices to figure that out in terms of how do you get on the radar screen of employers and figure out this whole job thing.
Well, and it's come up on this podcast before, Beth, how important resilience is. And often when you don't really have any other avenues, you figure it out by yourself and get creative and try different things. But
Yeah.
I think that's exactly what happened there. So now I'm going to, and I said I would go back to KPMG just because I'm trying to follow a bit of a trajectory with the timeline. So well over 2 decades, and sort of walk me through a little bit what that career journey was like, because certainly you emerged in leadership in short order after being there.
Right. So I started, as I said, I started more in the sort of owner managed business side, getting my experience. And actually, a big pivot point for me, when you go through the CA process, everybody writes this one big national exam. at the time it was called the UFI, right? And it's just this big milestone event, and you have to pass that in order to qualify to be a CA. So I didn't just pass it. I was the gold medalist with the top mark across Canada. And I only tell that story because all of a sudden this young girl who was in the suburban office of this big accounting firm was on the radar screen of partners, right, including downtown. And they were sort of focused all of a sudden to say, okay, we better pay attention and make sure, we get her on a good path and support her career development. So there's no doubt that doing well early on in my career, like technically, really helped to get me, as I said, basically on some radar screens. And so I ended up coming downtown and working for a couple of years in the Department of Professional Practice, which is where all the hard accounting problems go to get solved, basically, and being exposed to some great role models. And then coming out of that, I pivoted a bit from owner managed into auditing publicly listed companies. When I became a partner, that was in the heyday of tech IPOs. So it was just a real whirlwind, and I was in the technology practice. So, it was just a great time to learn and see all kinds of business models and work with all kinds of different teams and, some really meaty issues to dig your teeth into. And that was great fun. And I guess throughout that period, just coming a little bit back to the high school question you asked me, I was always getting involved in committees or task forces. I taught classes at KPMG. I remember coming off mat leave thinking there's got to be a better way. And I worked with our HR folks to put together this guide to returning from maternity leave. I just always was leaning in, particularly on a lot of the people issues, I would say. And then when you're in my annual sort of career discussion, I said, I'd really like to be considered for some kind of, business unit leadership position, whatever that might look like, whenever the opportunity comes. And I remember our Toronto managing partner at the time took me out for lunch, and he said, you're at a bit of a fork in the road with your career because you're really well known for your technical abilities. So you could go down this technical leadership path, right, and become the guru partners that I worked with when I went downtown for a couple of years, these technical sort of gurus that everybody goes to. He said, or you could go in the other direction and more sort of, business leadership, business management, like the running of the firm route. He said, so think, you need to think about it and make a choice. And so I leaned to the left on that one. And then from there, just in a matter of time, I had some opportunities to move into leadership roles. So.
Oh, and I think that's an interesting path, Beth, because this is, and one, I think you had some good guidance as well, but at the same time, you had sort of demonstrating ability on both sides, which it's always good to have that option versus if it was only one where you're like, well, yeah, this is your career path.
Right.
And what motivated you, at that stage, because it must have been a bit of leap of faith and a bit scary in some ways, to be like, okay, the leadership path is not, while there may be a natural inclination, it's not necessarily a safer path, like the technical one that you were on in some way.
No, that's true. And I remember when the first opportunity was presented to me, which was to become the chief HR officer at KPMG. That was a huge leap. And I remember the CEO saying, but just to be clear, you also are going to continue to be an audit partner and service your audit clients. And I thought, well, and at that point, I had two young kids, right? And I thought, whoa, this is big. But I think mentors are really important, or having people that will just be honest with you in terms of the risks and even just give you a boost in the arm in terms of your confidence. So I talked to a lot of partners who I really valued in terms of their wisdom and their advice, and they helped me understand why, like, leaning in and taking risks and getting really outside your comfort zone, especially early on when these first opportunities come forward, why it's so important, because that's where all the growth happens, right? Like, I didn't know anything about being a chief HR officer, except I had my gut instincts around people and people strategy. And, I knew how to lead teams because I'd been leading teams. So you're right, it was a big risk, but it's absolutely where the growth happened. So I think if it hadn't been for some mentors and people giving me a little shove. And then frankly, our CEO, he's the one who brought the opportunity to me. So there's a great example of a sponsor back in the day when we didn't even have a label for that, right? But
For
a
sure.
senior leader who used his power, right, to reach down into the ranks and finds, in this case, a young woman that he thought had potential and create, bring her into an opportunity.
For sure, and you're right. I think it also demonstrates what that existing leaders things they should consider, because that can completely change the trajectory of an ambitious
Yeah.
uh, young woman or young man's
Yeah.
life in the future.
Yeah. And in my experience, and I'm probably jumping ahead on your timeline now,
Oh
so
no,
sorry
it's
about
all
that.
good.
But that early experience really, I think, formed my own philosophy and view as a leader in terms of creating opportunities, particularly for women, but also recognizing that there may be more effort required by you as a leader in order to encourage women into those roles, because there tend to be, this is a generalization, but there's a lot of other things going on that they're thinking about, right? Can I manage this? I have two young kids. Is this the right time? Women in particular tend to think they're not qualified, right? That they haven't ticked all the boxes. You've probably seen the same research I have on that. And so unless you have a leader who's actually willing to have sometimes multiple conversations with somebody to bring them along, it's easy to default to the person who puts their hand up and jumps on it right away without thought. And so that is one thing that I've tried to do over my career, which is really recognize that sometimes it takes multiple conversations. Sometimes you have to start planting the seeds early on so that, people are sort of warm to the idea when the opportunity comes along.
Well, and Beth, I think that very concept has come up multiple times here. I remember a conversation with the CEO of Women in Governance, Caroline Kotze, where she talked about the imposter syndrome that women go through,
Right.
and how critical it is to overcome it. Because to your point, you didn't know much about being a chief human resource officer, but ultimately you figure it out, and sort of ambitious people with some resources can really get to the bottom
Right.
of it. Just takes that initiative and that
Right.
confidence, right?
And it's interesting you raise imposter syndrome. One of the things that I say to people, it's like the best kept secret of leadership. We all have it, and we all always have it, right? I'm sure you feel the same way, Gary, right? Sometimes, there's that little person on your shoulder whispering in your ear, like, what are you doing here? Do you know what you're doing? And that's just natural, right? That's sort of human. So I think hearing senior leaders acknowledge that and what they do to sort of cope with that self-doubt that creeps into your narrative, throughout your whole career journey, I think just helps younger leaders to realize, oh, this is perfectly normal, right? It's okay to feel this way.
Well, Beth, I think the mentors as well that you brought up is come up time after time as being critical, and the role that they can have. Did you have any mentors externally as well? Certainly, you mentioned some within KPMG. Did you look externally as well?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I mentioned my mom early on. I didn't look Early in my career, Gary, I didn't look explicitly for a mentor outside the firm. I think it just naturally happened. One of the really early mentors I had, and he was such a role model as a leader. My first substantive not-for-profit volunteer experience, one of the partners at KPMG got me onto, because I lived out in Ajax. It was a business program advisory committee at Durham College, and I ended up chairing that after a couple of years. And then I had an opportunity to go on the board of Durham College. So that was my first sort of big board role outside the firm. And the CEO of Durham College was an amazing leader, and I learned so much from him. And just the way, when people talk about tone at the top, right, and actions speak louder than words. This is a guy where if you walk down the hallways with him at Durham College, he would stop and pick up garbage and put it in the garbage can, like. And the way he was with all of the staff at the college. And anyways, he became a real mentor and a cheerleader for me. Just great leadership advice, and the kind of person I loved connecting with over the years. And yeah.
No, it's so important, the role of those leaders, Beth. I can completely appreciate that. So I will pivot a little bit. You had a excellent, illustrious career with KPMG, and then you pivot to a law firm. and
I
to a
know.
lot of people. and I know I fast forwarded a little bit, Beth, because and feel free for any examples to bring up from within KPMG, but just what prompted that sort of leadership change? Because it's certainly lawyers can benefit within the law firm ranks. I can tell you, having spending a lot of time with law firms and lawyers, they always say, "Well, accounting firms are always
Yeah.
thinking ahead in some ways that we don't, etc."
Yeah.
So, what? How did you find that, and the what was that like?
Yeah. So I had a great run at KPMG, a number, as you said, a number of different leadership roles, from running HR to running business units. And then I ran the Toronto office for 8 years. And the reason I changed, Gary, was I actually had put my name in and went through the process during the CEO succession process at KPMG, and it wasn't successful. So I spent that summer really thinking about what does that mean for me, and what do I want to do? And I came to the realization that I didn't think there was anything sort of left for me to do at KPMG, so I could keep growing as a leader. So it's a really tough decision, emotional decision, because I love and still do love KPMG. I decided to look outside the firm. And so that was kind of a scary proposition, because I don't, other than maybe putting together a CV for a not-for-profit board role, I mean, I hadn't really gone out, like I hadn't been in the job market. Anyway, so I had some good coaches outside KPMG that helped me think through the process. And, I looked at a number of different roles. I knew in my head sort of the criteria I had in mind in terms of what it should look and feel like. And then along came this opportunity at Dentons. So this was a firm, very similar structure to KPMG. So Canadian law firm, but part of a big global firm. And they had run an internal CEO process and then decided that they were a bit stuck from a business perspective in terms of, driving profitability, expanding the client base, people processes. And a lot of the law firms look to the accounting firms who tend to be further ahead. Some joke and say like the accounting firms are a decade ahead of the law firms, just in terms of evolution, in terms of some of those processes. And they said, oh, wouldn't it be great if we could find a leader coming out of one of those four firms? So I got this job spec from the executive search firm. And rarely do you ever look at something and sort of put a check mark beside everything, right? But it was like the stars aligned. I thought, oh my God, like I've done this job. I can do this job. It's professional services. It's a partnership structure. It's a global structure with a global aspect to it, which I've done. And I thought, I have so much that I can bring and share at this firm. And then the other thing that really excited me, frankly, was the opportunity to lead from the top and just lead the way I wanted to lead, and see if I could be effective doing that. So it was just a great opportunity at the right time, I think, for both of us. I really enjoyed it.
And I know there were a lot of parallels, obviously, to being at an accounting firm. To your point, partnership structure, international, etc. Any differences?
Oh yeah, that's a favorite question, either from lawyers or accountants. For sure, there are differences. So the practice of law itself is what surprised me the most was how individualized the practice of law still is. So at KPMG, a lot of the selling and the delivery of projects, whether it's in consulting or audit, it doesn't matter, is team-based. And it's a lot about the brand of the firm. And the brand of the firm matters in law too, but a lot of it is about the individual lawyer and their expertise and their chambers ranked as individuals. There's all these lawyers directories. Clients try to find the lawyer with that specific experience, regardless of the firm they're at. So they sort of start from a really different place that is grounded in this history of being about the individual. And you'll hear different language. Like people will talk about my client as opposed to the firm's client. And the concept of sort of cross-selling in other services is there, but in practice wasn't really that mature. So that was different. And then the other thing that was really different, of course, was I went from a firm of people who are quite like financially grounded, right? They're CAs, they're MBAs, they're consultants, to a firm of lawyers where some have a business grounding, lots do not. And so I found even when I was talking about the financial results with them, I really had to step back and go back to basics in terms of, this is what these terms mean. This is why it matters. This is how it puts profit on the bottom line. So that was a big difference. But other than that, they're really smart professionals who are motivated and passionate about serving clients. And the whole apprenticeship type model with young professionals coming through, very similar, right, conceptually to KPMG. So yeah, and then the rest was about professionalizing some of the business processes and people processes.
And Beth, certainly that was another one of those leap of faith that get past imposter syndrome, saying,
Yeah.
"Yes, I've never done this before, but let's grab the bull by the horns and do it." So, sort of, I think that there's a pattern of this with you. So, it certainly didn't come. The sort of taking that challenge up is one of those things that, as a takeaway to anyone that will listen to the podcast, it's like grab the bull by the horns.
Well, for sure, Gary. And the reason being, I think my past experiences sort of leaping from all these different businesses inside KPMG, agility, like being agile and having that ability to move into these new experiences and trust in your fundamental competencies, right? As a leader, like that individual playbook you have. The more you do that, the more it becomes basically a muscle, right? That you can exercise no matter where you go. Because you'll have a pattern, right? In terms of starting with listening to understand and then getting the right team in place. And, there's a process that you go through as you jump into these new roles. I think, the banks and some of the other large corporates do it well when they purposely try to move high potential leaders around to different roles. And there's a reason they do that, right? It is to help you kind of hone that muscle of leadership and then realize, well, you can take those skills and apply them really in any setting. You don't have to be the technical expert in the field. And that was a big shock for me at KPMG. I went from being the technical audit expert to running HR where I didn't have expertise. And so you learn pretty quickly. You rely on your team, right? You're there to lead, guide, support, hold accountable, sort of set the direction, but you're not the expert. Right.
For sure. And Beth, on that note, having done this a few times, what were some of the easiest ways, or I shouldn't say easiest ways, some of the most successful ways to actually adapt to a role faster? So what are some of the learnings that you're like, by doing this, you could actually sort out that role faster? And I'm asking that question.
That adage, sometimes you have to go slow to go fast.
Right.
That would be my advice, to sort of catch your breath. And I really, I had to be disciplined about that going over to Dentons, because in some case I could see what the solution needed to be because I had seen it at KPMG, but nobody's going to follow you, right? And the change isn't going to stick if you just try to go in and say, oh, well, I know best. This is how to do it, or this is how it worked over there. So for me, it's all about listening early on, really taking the time to talk to, the people on the team, or sort of through the ranks, really listening first to understand and get a sense of where people are at. And my experience, Gary, is that when you do that, people will articulate the pain points. You probably know them and can spot them right away as an experienced leader, but it's so much better if you give people the space and opportunity to say, well, these are the 3 things I really wish would change. And these are the 2 things, like, please don't change those. And then, then you can sort of synthesize all of that, compile it, and then bring people along. You get a sense of where they're at. You can start where they're at and then start bringing them along, right, on the journey. And then ideally what they do is they just take it up and they run with it, right? Like, your job is done. You give them the resources and support and help them if they hit a bump in the road, but then your job is done because they're off to the races.
So it's such a key takeaway: go slow so you can go fast, and to get that buy-in and sort of over communicating. It's just so important. And Beth, sort of now you're doing a series of board positions, and how was the next evolution? Because again, as you can imagine, many experienced leaders are in those shoes, and and often not even sure how to approach it. What was that path like?
Um, I would actually step back a bit, Gary, and say it really started with doing work as a board volunteer on not-for-profits, right? So that's another piece of advice I would give to people for sure. It's such a great opportunity early in your career to also hone your leadership and sometimes get a chance to do things. You do things that, as a board member with a not-for-profit that you don't even have the opportunity to do inside your own workplace, right? Because there's like, 4 hierarchies above you, but on the not-for-profit, you're the treasurer, right? Or you're the chair of the committee. And
That's right.
so anyways, I would say comfort with board level governance and how boards operate and the difference between sort of management and the board certainly help. Like that shaped it in terms of my not-for-profit experience. And then obviously at KPMG as a senior executive, I would face the board, and certainly as the CEO at Dentons, I mean, the board's your boss, right? So I certainly had a good handle on working with the board as a leader. When I went to Dentons, I did negotiate that I could take on one public company board. So I started my board director career sort of early while I was still a CEO at Dentons. So it was a little more natural, I think, when I left Dentons. I knew the timing around my departure, so I was able to start some conversations with some search firms fairly early on in terms of what I was thinking about and looking for, and leveraged my network and made the transition. And I love it. Some people say, "Oh, you're not going to like it because you're not the operator anymore, making operating decisions," but it's terrific. And I have such a diverse portfolio. It's really stimulating. So different business models, different people, lots of change and transformation happening. And yeah, I really enjoy it.
Well, and I think, Beth, I'm not surprised that you are enjoying it. I think the organizations that you end up joining can also dictate a bit what that role is like. So I think you've picked them sort of that in a way that fits nicely with your background,
Mm-hmm.
and where the operational background can also come in handy. I often found, sort of having seen a variety of board members, are the ones that have good operational experience can also provide good insights, versus otherwise they can't relate as much to some of the challenges that
Exactly.
management teams go through. So
Exactly. And you draw on that sense of, there's a sense of practicality, right? There's the theory, and then there's sort of the practical response. So I think having been an executive helps because you understand trade-offs, right? You understand the need to prioritize, scarce resources, capital allocation. You've been there making those decisions. And I think, certainly my experience as a CEO at Dentons, you also understand the value a board can bring, both in terms of asking you questions that maybe you hadn't really, that cause you to go back and rethink something, right? And so, I appreciated that as a CEO, and being able to, if you can add value that way as a board member, it's great. And you can frame your questions in a way that they're well received by management, right? Having been on the receiving end of questions or challenges, right, which are totally appropriate from board members as well. Yeah.
well, and Beth, the other point that has come up time after time is the importance of giving back to the community and these not-for-profit boards, because in return, what you get out of it as well is just so important in terms of understanding what this is like, and they set you up nicely for some of the for-profit boards that can follow.
Yeah, exactly.
So, Beth, I will pivot to what we call some of the rapid fire questions of the
Okay.
podcast. And I have lots of questions for you, but the team always tells me, "Look, Gary, you have to keep this crisp because while there's lots of questions, we need to make sure that they're in a way that it can be consumed by a broader audience." Uh, but just before I do, Beth, any sort of takeaways to an audience of professionals and aspiring young professionals that we may have not gotten to as a takeaway that you thought it would be worth sharing this, but that Gary didn't get a chance to ask me about it?
Oh, I know
And
we've talked about a lot, if you think about advice for young professionals, right? Getting involved on a community board, um, just taking the risk, leaning into the opportunity when it's in front of you. One of my mentors once said to me, well, you can say no now if you want to the opportunity, but just know that when you think you're ready, the same opportunity might not be there then, right? Sorry, that just like sticks with me
For
every
sure.
time somebody comes forward with an opportunity for me. And sometimes it is the right time to say no, but there's a trade-off when you say no. Importance of mentors and sponsors. I've heard from some young professionals in terms of getting involved with the community, but it's so hard because I'm so busy at work and I need to give my all there, and I have a young family, and I don't really like the word balance. I always thought of it more as integration. So I always thought of my involvement in the community. First of all, it's really important to be involved with an organization or a cause that you actually care about and are passionate about, because you are giving of your discretionary time. So it's important that it feels good to you as a person, right? As a human being. But I would think of it as integration with your professional life, and the learning opportunities, the networking, the mentors that you can find around those tables. It's just so worth it. I can't emphasize that enough. The other thing that I often tell young professionals, Gary, professionals, people will come to me and say, oh, like, I really want to get promoted to partner, right? Or how do I get like promoted to senior director, whatever the structure is in your organization. And I often tell people, don't chase a title just for the sake of the title. If you focus on being a leader in every role that you're in, so think about, well, I'm in this role, or I'm a manager for the next 2 years. How am I going to have impact, right? How is this team going to be better because I was the manager of the team? Like when I
Absolutely.
leave, what have I left better, right, for the next person coming in? And I do think if you adopt that personal philosophy, then the leadership opportunities are going to come, right? And you can be ambitious for those opportunities. Like I do believe in ambition, but the way you get there is being ambitious about what you're in today.
Yeah. No, it's so true. And Beth, to your point, it's not like we have somehow when in the early stages of the career, we feel like, oh, I'll have more time later on so I can do some of this involvement, etc. And you never really have more time. So you got
No,
to do it early on.
no, exactly. Yeah. I mean, my current stage is, is a good example of that. I have more flexibility, but I think my husband would tell you, I don't think she has a lot more time. So,
And I have no doubt that's the case. And so, Beth, really appreciate that. I'll actually pivot to our what we call our rapid fire questions. And
sure.
for these, first thing that comes to mind, they're just supposed to be fun, interactive,
Okay.
and not nothing sort of one word. It could be as little as one word.
Okay.
So the first question: what is your favorite word?
Well, Gary, I just spent the weekend with my 4 girlfriends, so I'm going to say friendship. I feel that this morning I just feel so much friendship.
And so important. What word do you hate?
Try. I don't believe you either do or you don't try.
Oh, I love that. What word do you have a hard time pronouncing, if any?
uh, Mass- Massachusetts. You can
That
say
one
it. I'm
is,
not saying it again.
it's meant to be confusing, so it's not your fault.
Uh, I know it's not. It's not a word. It's a place, but it's
No,
terrible.
no, it's fair.
I'm just glad I'm not from there.
What is your favorite word in another language, if any?
Amore.
Uh, who can argue with love?
Yeah.
And do you speak any other languages?
Well, since I'm talking to you, I wish I could say yes, I do competently, but I only speak one competently, and then I can understand a little bit of French.
And what's one word to describe yourself by?
Mm, compassionate.
And I think Beth, so important, compassion to everything you do in leadership. Beth, I so appreciate you joining me on this podcast. And it's like I said, I had to hold back from so much more I wanted to ask you.
It
But
went so quickly. It was so fun, Gary. Thanks. Thank you for inviting me. I really appreciate it.